The world of Elkerd has always been divided, carved into territories by hatred as old as the mountains themselves. Three races share this realm, but sharing implies cooperation, and cooperation has never existed here. The werewolves rule the northern forests, organized into clans that follow the ancient hierarchy of Alpha, Beta, and Omega. They are proud, territorial, and convinced of their superiority over all other beings. The Arcanites soar through the southern skies, winged demons bound to fire and truth. Their magic is fierce as their independence. And caught between these two dominant forces are the humans, powerless, fragmented, existing as servants, mediators, or slaves depending on who currently controls their settlements. The werewolves despise the Arcanites with a passion that burns hotter than demon fire. They call them abominations, creatures who should never have been given the gift of flight, whose very existence is an insult to the natural order. The Arcanites, in turn, view the werewolves as crude beasts who waste their potential on petty territorial squabbles and rigid social structures. Neither race acknowledges humans as more than convenient tools. This was the world I was born into, and for 21 years, I believed I understood my place in it. My name is Kyle, and I am an Omega werewolf of the Grey Claw clan. Or rather, I was. My story begins and ends with rejection, though between those 2 points lies a journey I could never have imagined when I first felt the stirring of my prophetic gift. The gift manifested when I was 16, during the traditional coming-of-age ceremony. While other young wolves were discovering their adult sense or their positions in the pack hierarchy, I was overwhelmed by visions of possible futures, fragments of scenes that might come to pass, warnings of dangers that could still be avoided, glimpses of joy that might be earned through the right choices. The pack elders were disturbed by my abilities. Prophecy was considered a dangerous gift, one that had been associated throughout werewolf history with tragedy and upheaval. Cursed sight, they called it, and they whispered that Omegas who possessed it were more trouble than they were worth. But I had something that made the pack tolerate my unsettling gift, a fated mate bond with Roivan, the alpha heir of Grey Claw clan. Roivan was everything an alpha should be, tall, powerful, with the kind of commanding presence that made other wolves instinctively submit. His dark hair caught the light like polished obsidian, and his amber eyes held the fierce intelligence that had marked him as future pack leader since childhood. When we were children, he had been kind to me in the casual way alphas are kind to Omega pups. As we grew older and the bond between us became more apparent, that kindness had slowly transformed into something deeper and more complex. The fated mate bond is sacred to werewolves. It's believed to be chosen by the moon goddess herself, a perfect pairing that will strengthen both individuals and the pack as a whole. To reject a fated mate is to reject divine will, and such rejection brings consequences that echo through generations. But that's exactly what Roivan did. The fated mate ceremony takes place under the full moon, when the bonds between destined pairs become visible as threads of silver light. I had been preparing for this night for months, knowing that after the ceremony, Roivan and I would be officially bonded, our lives intertwined forever. The entire clan gathered in the sacred grove, their excitement filling the air with anticipation. I stood with the other unmated Omegas, my heart racing as I felt the familiar pull toward my destined partner. Across the circle, Roivan stood with the alphas, his expression unreadable in the moonlight. When the ceremony began and the silver threads appeared, connecting fated pairs throughout the grove, mine was among the brightest. The light stretched between Roivan and me like spun starlight, beautiful and undeniable. I stepped forward, as tradition demanded, my hand extended toward my mate. For a moment, I saw something soft in Roivan's eyes, something that might have been tenderness or even love. But then his face hardened, and he spoke the words that would shatter my world. I will not bind myself to an Omega who bears the gift of the cursed. His voice rang out across the grove, loud enough for every wolf present to hear. Let fate choose for others. I choose the pride of my clan. The silver thread connecting us began to tremble as he rejected the bond. I stood frozen, unable to comprehend what was happening, even as my prophetic gift showed me flashes of the humiliation to come. With deliberate ceremony, Roivan reached up and grasped the silver thread. The light burned his hands as he tore it apart, severing our bond with a sound like breaking crystal. He cast the broken pieces to the ground and stepped on them, grinding them into the earth. The physical pain of bond severance hit me like a blow to the chest. I doubled over, gasping, as something vital tore loose inside me. But the emotional pain was worse, the knowledge that my fated mate, the one person who was supposed to love and accept me unconditionally, had found me so fundamentally flawed that he would rather defy divine will than be tied to me. The pack's reaction was swift and brutal. An Omega whose fated mate had publicly rejected them was seen as cursed, tainted, dangerous to the stability of the pack structure. They surrounded me in the grove, their faces twisted with disgust and fear. Abomination, someone spat. No wonder his mate couldn't stomach the bond. They stripped me of my clan markers, the silver pieces that identified me as Grey Claw Pack. They burned the symbols into my skin to mark me as rejected, cast out, Omega non grata. The pain of the brands was nothing compared to the agony of watching my entire world turn against me. You have until dawn to leave our territory, the Pack Beta announced. If you're found on Grey Claw lands after sunrise, you'll be killed as a rogue. I stumbled away from the grove, my body and spirit broken, carrying nothing but the clothes on my back and the bitter knowledge that I was completely alone in the world. For 3 days, I wandered the borderlands between territories, surviving on stream water and the few edible plants I could identify. My prophetic visions had deserted me, leaving behind only empty silence where guidance should have been. I began to think that perhaps the pack had been right, perhaps I was cursed, and my gift had been taken away as punishment for some crime I couldn't remember committing. It was on the 4th day that the Arcanites found me. I had collapsed beside a small stream, too weak from hunger and heartbreak to continue walking. The sound of wings overhead made me look up, expecting to see birds. Instead, I saw creatures that had haunted werewolf nightmares for generations, winged demons with human-like forms and eyes that burned with inner fire. There were 3 of them, their massive wings casting shadows that blocked out the sun. They landed around me with predatory grace, studying me with the detached interest of scholars examining an interesting specimen. Werewolf, one of them said, his voice carrying the crackling undertone of flame. Omega by the scent. What's a pack wolf doing alone in the borderlands? Cast out, another observed, noting the fresh brands on my skin. Rejected and abandoned. How typical of werewolf society. Could be useful, the third added. Wolf magic is rare in the southern markets. Even a broken Omega might have value as a curiosity. They spoke about me as if I weren't present, as if I were already an object to be bought and sold rather than a person with thoughts and feelings. But I was too exhausted to protest when they bound my hands and loaded me onto their flying mount, a creature of living shadow with wings that seemed to absorb light. The flight south was a blur of wind and terror. I had never been so high above the ground, had never seen the world spread out below like a vast tapestry of forests and mountains and rivers. It might have been beautiful if I hadn't been a prisoner, if I hadn't been flying toward an uncertain fate in the lands of werewolf enemies. The Arcanite city of Pyrrhion was unlike anything I had ever imagined. Built into the side of a massive volcano, it was a maze of bridges and platforms and towers that seemed to defy gravity. Lava flows had been channeled into decorative patterns throughout the city, providing both light and heat while creating an otherworldly beauty that took my breath away. The slave market was located in the lower levels of the city, in chambers carved directly from volcanic rock. The air was thick with heat and the mingled scents of dozens of different species, humans mostly, but also a few captured werewolves, some beings I didn't recognize, and even what looked like a young dragon curled in one corner. I was processed like merchandise, examined by potential buyers who poked and prodded me as if I were livestock. Most showed little interest. A broken Omega with no useful skills wasn't exactly a premium purchase. But one buyer was different from the rest. Orion approached my holding cell just as I was beginning to think I would be left to rot in the volcanic depths of Pyrrhion. He was tall even for an Arcanite, with wings that spanned nearly 12 feet when fully extended. His skin had the golden cast that marked him as a fire demon, and his hair was the color of burnished copper. but it was his eyes that held my attention, deep amber flecked with gold, intelligent and ancient and strangely kind. "This one," he said to the slave trader, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I'll take him." "Excellent choice, Lord Orion," the trader simpered. "A werewolf Omega with prophetic abilities, very rare, very valuable. His pack rejected him, so there's no danger of retaliation. He's all yours." Orion nodded absently, his attention focused on me. "Can you understand me, Wolf?" I looked up at him, this demon who had just purchased me like a piece of furniture, and found my voice for the first time in days. "Yes." "Good. You'll be coming with me. I have use for someone with your particular gifts." He led me through the winding streets of Pirion to a tower that rose high above the rest of the city. The building was elegant and imposing, with windows that looked out over the volcanic landscape and balconies where he could land after flight. Inside, it was furnished with a comfort and taste that spoke of wealth and education. Books in multiple languages, artwork from across the realm, furniture that managed to be both beautiful and functional. "What's your name?" he asked as he showed me to a room that would apparently be mine. "Kyle," I said, then added bitterly, "Formerly of Grey Claw Clan." "Formerly, yes. That life is over." His tone was matter-of-fact rather than cruel. "Here, you'll be known as something else. What shall we call you?" I stared at him, confused by the question. I don't understand. Your old name belongs to your old life, and that life ended when your pack cast you out. Here, you can be whoever you choose to be." He studied my face thoughtfully. "You're not afraid of me." It was true despite everything I had been taught about Arcanites, despite my current status as his property. I felt no fear when I looked at Orion. Wariness, yes, and uncertainty about what he planned to do with me. But not fear. "Should I be?" I asked. "Most would be. I am, after all, one of the demons your people have been taught to hate and fear." He folded his wings against his back in a gesture that somehow made him seem less imposing. "But you look at me like you're trying to understand me rather than planning how to escape or attack me." "I have nowhere to escape to," I pointed out, "and I'm hardly in a position to attack anyone." "True enough." He was quiet for a moment, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'll call you Wing Fighter, because you don't fear my wings, and because I suspect you'll fight for what matters to you when the time comes." Wing Fighter. The name felt strange in my mouth, but not unpleasant. It was strong, dignified, nothing like the whispered, cursed one I had become accustomed to hearing. "It suits you," Orion said with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "Now, let me explain what your duties will be here." Over the following days, I learned that Orion's use for me was far different from what I had expected. He wasn't interested in me as a servant or a slave in the traditional sense. Instead, he wanted to understand my prophetic abilities, to learn how werewolf magic worked, to explore the possibilities of cross-species magical cooperation. Werewolves and Arcanites have been enemies for so long that we've forgotten we might have something to learn from each other, he explained as we worked together in his study, surrounded by books and scrolls and magical artifacts. "Your gift of prophecy is fascinating. It operates on completely different principles from Arcanite Truth Sight." "Truth Sight?" I asked, looking up from the ancient text I was translating. "The ability to see through deception, to perceive the reality beneath surface appearances. All Arcanites possess it to some degree, but it's nothing like your gift of seeing potential futures." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with those penetrating amber eyes. "Tell me, when you have visions, do you see what will happen, or what might happen?" I considered the question carefully. "What might happen, I think. The future isn't fixed, it changes based on the choices people make. My visions show me possibilities, warnings about paths that could lead to tragedy or hints about opportunities that might bring joy." "Fascinating. And you have no control over when these visions occur?" "None at all. They come when they choose to come, and they leave me just as suddenly." I hesitated, then added, "They haven't come at all since my rejection. I think perhaps the gift left me when the bond was broken." Orion was quiet for a long moment, his expression thoughtful. Or perhaps the gift is still there, but trauma has created a barrier between you and your abilities. Magical gifts don't simply disappear. They may become dormant, but they rarely vanish entirely. The possibility that my prophetic abilities might return gave me the first hope I had felt since leaving Grey Claw territory. If my gift came back, if I could prove that I wasn't cursed or broken, then maybe I could build some kind of meaningful life for myself. Our conversations became the highlight of my days. Orion was intelligent and well-traveled, with knowledge spanning multiple realms and cultures. He spoke to me not as property but as an equal, asking for my opinions, valuing my insights, treating me with a respect I had never experienced even among my own pack. Slowly, tentatively, I began to share more of myself with him. I told him about my childhood in Grey Claw Pack, about the loneliness of being the only Omega with prophetic abilities, about the pain of growing up knowing that many pack members saw me as a burden to be tolerated rather than a member to be valued. They were fools, Orion said bluntly after I had described the pack's reaction to my gift. Prophecy is one of the rarest and most valuable magical abilities in existence. To treat someone with that gift as cursed is beyond stupid. It's actively harmful to their own interests. The elders said it brought bad luck, I said, repeating the explanation I had heard countless times. That Omegas with prophetic abilities were troublemakers who disrupted pack stability. The elders were afraid, Orion corrected. Prophecy reveals uncomfortable truths, forces people to confront the consequences of their actions before those consequences become inevitable. Those in power often prefer ignorance to knowledge that might challenge their authority. His interpretation of my gift was so different from everything I had been taught that it took me weeks to begin accepting it. But gradually, as our trust in each other deepened, I started to believe that maybe my abilities weren't a curse after all. It was during this period of growing trust that we encountered Lyra. I found the child during one of my rare trips outside Orion's tower. He had given me permission to explore the lower levels of Pyrrhion, partly because he wanted me to become familiar with Arcanite culture and partly because he believed fresh air and exercise would be good for my recovery from the trauma of rejection. Lyra was huddled in an alley between two buildings, a human boy of perhaps 8 years old, thin and dirty and obviously alone. When he saw me approaching, he tried to run, but he was too weak from hunger to get far. "Hey," I said gently, crouching down to his level. "I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost?" The child stared at me with eyes too old for his face. "You're a werewolf," he whispered, "but you don't smell like Pack." "I'm not Pack anymore," I said simply. "What's your name?" "Lyra. I used to live with my mother, but she died last month. Now I don't have anywhere to go." My heart broke for this small, abandoned creature. I knew what it felt like to be cast out, to have nowhere to turn, to face the world completely alone. "Would you like to come with me?" I asked. "I live with someone who might be able to help you." Lyra hesitated, clearly torn between desperation and caution. "The man you live with, is he nice?" "He's complicated," I said honestly. "But he's not cruel, and he's powerful enough to protect you if you need protection." The child must have heard something in my voice that convinced him, because he nodded slowly and allowed me to take his hand. Orion's reaction to my bringing home a stray human child was not what I had expected. "You can't keep him," he said flatly as we stood in his study, Lyra hidden behind my legs and peering out at the intimidating demon with wide eyes. "Why not?" I asked, my protective instincts flaring. "He has nowhere else to go." "Children are a burden," Orion said, but there was something in his tone that suggested he was arguing with himself as much as with me. "They require constant attention, they're expensive to maintain, and they serve no useful purpose." "No," I said firmly, surprising myself with my vehemence. "Children are a reminder that the world can still change. They're hope for a better future, proof that love and growth are still possible even in the darkest times." Orion stared at me for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. "You really believe that?" "Yes, I do." He was quiet for several heartbeats, then sighed in apparent defeat. "Very well, the child can stay. But he's your responsibility." I won't have my routine disrupted by childish nonsense. Despite his gruff words, I noticed that Orion left out food for Lyra that first night, and within a week, he had set up a small bed in a room adjacent to mine. For all his protests about children being burdens, he seemed to take a quiet pleasure in having young life in his tower. Lyra's presence changed the dynamic between Orion and me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Caring for the child together created a sense of family, of shared purpose, that went beyond our intellectual partnership. We found ourselves working as a team. I handled most of Lyra's daily care while Orion provided resources and occasional guidance. "You're good with him," Orion observed one evening as we watched Lyra play with a set of building blocks that had mysteriously appeared in the tower's common room. "I like children," I said simply. "They see the world with such clarity, without all the prejudices and fears that adults accumulate." "Is that why you wanted to keep him? Because he represents innocence?" I considered the question seriously. "Partly, but mostly because I know what it feels like to be abandoned, and I couldn't bear the thought of leaving him to face that alone." Orion was quiet for a moment, his gaze thoughtful. "You have a good heart, wing fighter. Too good for this harsh world, perhaps." "My heart got me exiled from my pack and sold into slavery," I pointed out. "Maybe a little less goodness would have served me better." "Your pack's rejection says nothing about your worth and everything about their limitations," Orion said firmly. "And as for slavery, you're not a slave here. You're—" He trailed off, seeming uncertain about how to categorize our relationship. "What am I?" I asked softly. "You're—" He struggled with the words, then seemed to give up on finding the perfect classification. "You're important to me." The admission hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us was quite ready to examine. But it marked a turning point in our relationship, the moment when we both acknowledged that our connection had grown beyond anything that could be explained by practical necessity or intellectual curiosity. From that night forward, small gestures of care began appearing in our daily routine. Orion would leave my favorite tea waiting for me in the mornings. I would mend tears in his clothing or organize his papers when he was too busy to do it himself. He began staying nearby when I felt unwell, and I started sitting with him during his evening meditation sessions. Our first kiss happened almost by accident during one of Lyra's bedtime stories. The child had fallen asleep in my lap while I was reading to him, and Orion had come to help me move him to his own bed. As we bent over the sleeping form together, our faces came close enough that I could feel his breath against my cheek. The kiss was gentle, tentative, more a question than a demand. When we broke apart, Orion's eyes held a wonder that took my breath away. "I didn't plan for this to happen," he said quietly. "Neither did I admitted. "But I'm glad it did." We were careful not to wake Lyra as we moved him to his room. But once the child was settled, we found ourselves alone together with a new awareness crackling between us. "I should warn you," Orion said as we stood in the hallway outside Lyra's door. "I've never been in love before. I'm not certain I'll be good at it." "I thought I was in love once," I replied. "But this feels completely different from anything I experienced with Royven. This feels real." "Real," he repeated as if testing the word. "Yes, I think that's exactly what this is." Our relationship deepened slowly over the following months. We were both cautious, both carrying scars from past hurt, both uncertain about the wisdom of loving across species lines. But what we felt for each other was undeniable, growing stronger with each passing day. It was Orion who first spoke the words. "I love you," he said one morning as we sat together on his balcony, watching the sunrise paint the volcanic landscape in shades of gold and crimson. "I know it complicates everything. I know it defies logic and tradition and probably good sense. But I love you." "I love you too," I replied, the words feeling like a gift I was finally allowed to give. More than I ever thought possible. We might have continued building our quiet life together indefinitely, but the outside world had other plans for us. The war began 6 months after Lyra joined our household, sparked by an incident that would later be revealed as deliberate provocation by those who profited from conflict. A delegation of werewolves had been traveling through neutral territory when they were attacked by unknown assailants. The survivors claimed their attackers had been Arcanites, though the evidence was inconsistent and several details of their story didn't align with known Arcanite tactics. The Blood Senate, the council that governed relations between werewolf clans, declared the attack an act of war and began mobilizing for a campaign against the demon territories. Ancient grudges were dredged up, old wounds reopened, and both sides began preparing for a conflict that would cost countless lives. It was during this escalating tension that Roivan appeared at Orion's tower. I was in the garden with Lyra when I felt the familiar sensation of werewolf presence nearby. My prophetic gift, which had been slowly returning over the past months, suddenly flared to life with a vision of amber eyes and the silver thread of a broken bond. Inside, I told Lyra urgently, "Go find Orion and tell him we have visitors." The child, who had learned to trust my instincts implicitly, ran for the tower without question. I remained in the garden, steeling myself for a confrontation I had been dreading since the day I was exiled. Roivan landed on the garden wall in his wolf form, then shifted to human shape with the fluid grace that had once made my heart race. He looked older than I remembered, harder, with new lines around his eyes that spoke of responsibility and perhaps regret. "Kyle," he said, and hearing my old name from his lips was like being struck. "We need to talk." "No," I said firmly. "We don't. You made your position clear at the bonding ceremony." "That was a mistake," he said, jumping down from the wall to approach me. "I was young, stupid, afraid of what the pack would think if I bonded with an Omega who had prophetic abilities. But I've had time to think, time to realize what I threw away." "You threw away nothing," I said, backing away from him as he came closer. "You rejected a bond you didn't want with someone you couldn't accept. That was your choice, and you lived with the consequences." "I want to fix it," he said desperately. "I want to claim you properly, to give you the bonding you deserved. We're fated mates. Kyle, that bond might be damaged, but it's not completely broken. We could repair it." "Even if that were possible," I said, "I wouldn't want it. I'm not the same person I was when you rejected me. I've built a life here, found love, created a family. I'm not the abandoned Omega you cast out." "You're living with demons," Roivan said, his tone shifting to disgust. "They've corrupted you, made you forget what you really are. But I can save you from that. I can bring you home." "This is my home," I said firmly. "These people are my family. And the demon you're so worried about loves me in ways you never could." Before Roivan could respond, Orion appeared on the balcony above us. His wings spread wide in a display of power and protection. His eyes blazed with inner fire, and when he spoke, his voice carried the crackling authority of barely restrained flame. "You're trespassing on my property," he said, his attention focused entirely on Roivan. "Leave, now." "I'm here for my fated mate," Roivan replied, his alpha dominance rising to meet Orion's challenge. "He belongs with his own kind, not as a pet for demons." "He belongs wherever he chooses to be," Orion said, landing gracefully in the garden between Roivan and me. "And he's chosen to be here." The two powerful beings faced each other across the garden, predator recognizing predator, both prepared to fight for what they claimed. But it was my voice that cut through the tension. "Stop," I said, stepping between them before violence could erupt. "Both of you. I'm not property to be claimed or territory to be defended. I'm a person with my own will, my own choices, my own voice." I turned to face Roivan directly, drawing on every ounce of strength I had gained during my time in exile. "You didn't lose an Omega when you rejected our bond," I said clearly. "You lost a person who could have loved you completely, who would have stood by your side through every challenge, who would have made you stronger instead of weaker. But you were too afraid of what others might think to accept that gift." "Kyle, my name is Wingfighter now," I interrupted. "Kyle died in that grove when you tore apart our bond. The person standing here chose to survive, chose to heal, chose to love someone who wasn't afraid of my gifts or my scars." I glanced back at Orion, drawing comfort from his presence. Someone who saw value in me when I couldn't see it in myself. Someone who built me up instead of tearing me down. The war is coming, Roivan said, his tone shifting to urgent pleading. When the clans march against the demons, you'll be caught in the middle. Come home with me, and I can protect you. The war is coming because people like you refuse to see past old prejudices, I replied. And when it arrives, I'll face it with the family I've chosen. Roivan stared at me for a long moment, perhaps finally recognizing that the Omega he had rejected no longer existed. When he spoke again, his voice was heavy with loss. I loved you, he said quietly. In my own flawed way, I did love you. I know, I said, and found that I could forgive him without needing to forget the pain he had caused. But love isn't enough if it comes with conditions. And your love always came with the condition that I be someone other than who I was. He left after that, shifting back to wolf form and disappearing into the forest. I watched him go with sadness but no regret, knowing that this final confrontation had closed a chapter of my life that needed to be finished. Are you all right? Orion asked, his hand coming to rest gently on my shoulder. Yes, I said, and realized I meant it completely. I'm exactly where I belong. The war that followed was brutal and devastating, claiming lives on both sides while accomplishing nothing beyond the destruction of homes and the creation of new grievances. But it also created opportunities for those willing to see beyond traditional boundaries. As the conflict escalated, refugees began arriving at Orion's tower, humans fleeing the violence, werewolves who refused to fight in what they saw as a pointless war, even a few Arcanites who had grown tired of the endless cycle of hatred and revenge. We can't house them all, Orion said as we looked out over the growing encampment that had sprung up around his tower. Then we'll build more housing, I replied. We'll create a place where people can live without having to choose sides in a war they never wanted. A neutral settlement? That's never been tried before. Maybe it's time to try something new. What began as a temporary refuge gradually evolved into something more permanent. We established gardens to feed our growing population, workshops where refugees could learn new skills, schools where children like Lyra could receive education that emphasized cooperation rather than conflict. Most importantly, we created a community where the old divisions between races meant less than individual character and shared values. Werewolves worked alongside Arcanites, humans served as mediators and teachers, and slowly, gradually, people began to see past the prejudices that had defined their former lives. It wasn't easy. There were conflicts, misunderstandings, moments when old hatreds threatened to tear apart everything we had built. But each crisis we survived together made the community stronger, more resilient, more committed to the ideals of acceptance and cooperation. You've created something remarkable here, a human trader told me one day as he prepared to leave our settlement after a week of conducting business. I've traveled throughout Elkard, and I've never seen anything like this. People from different races actually working together, actually caring about each other's welfare. It's not perfect, I said, watching Lyra play with a group of children that included young werewolves, humans, and even a few Arcanite juveniles. But it's better than what came before. Much better, he agreed, and it gives me hope that maybe the future will be different from the past. Hope, that was what we were building here. Hope for a world where difference didn't automatically mean conflict, where love could transcend traditional boundaries, where individuals could choose their own paths rather than being trapped by the circumstances of their birth. The Blood Senate eventually took notice of our growing settlement, and their response was predictably hostile. You harbor enemies of the werewolf people, the messenger declared when he arrived with the Senate's ultimatum. You provide aid and comfort to demons and their sympathizers. Surrender yourself for judgment, or face the consequences of continued defiance. And what judgment would that be? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Death, for treason against your own species. I looked around at the community we had built, at the people who had found safety and purpose within our borders, at the children who were growing up believing that cooperation was possible. Tell the Senate that I stand before a higher court, I said finally. The court of conscience, which judges actions by their results rather than their adherence to tradition. And that court finds our work here to be just and necessary. You would choose demons over your own kind? I choose love over hate, I replied. I choose building over destroying. I choose hope over fear. If that makes me a traitor in the Senate's eyes, then I accept that judgment. The messenger left, but we all knew he would return with more than words. The attack came a month later under cover of darkness, led by werewolf warriors who had been convinced that our settlement represented an existential threat to their way of life. They came expecting to find a small group of refugees and dissidents, easy targets for superior numbers and coordination. Instead, they found a community that had learned to defend itself, where Arcanite fire magic worked in harmony with werewolf strength and human ingenuity to create defenses that none of the attackers had anticipated. The battle was fierce but brief. Our defenders fought not just to protect themselves but to preserve something precious and unique, while the attackers were motivated primarily by abstract ideology. In the end, ideology proved insufficient against the power of people fighting for their homes and families. When the fighting was over and the surviving attackers had retreated, we gathered in the settlement's central square to tend to wounds and count losses. The cost had been heavy. Several of our people had been killed, many more injured, and buildings had been damaged or destroyed. But we had survived, and our survival sent a message throughout Elkard that change was possible, that the old ways of division and hatred were not inevitable. "They'll be back," Orion said as we stood together surveying the damage. "The Senate won't accept this defeat easily." "Let them come," I replied. "Each time they attack us, they prove that we represent something they fear. And what they fear is the possibility that they might be wrong about everything they've built their power on." "You've changed," he observed, studying my face in the firelight. "When I first bought you in the slave market, you were broken, defeated, convinced that you were worthless. Now you're leading a revolution. You helped me remember who I was beneath the damage," I said, leaning into his warmth. "You and Lyra and everyone else who chose to build something better instead of accepting what we were given. I love who you've become," he said softly. "But I also loved who you were when you arrived here, wounded and afraid, but still willing to protect a stranger's child, still capable of seeing beauty in the midst of pain." "We weren't made for each other," I said, echoing words he had spoken during our early days together. "But we chose each other, and that choice is stronger than any fate." Above us, the stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to the struggles of earthbound beings. But here in our settlement, surrounded by people who had learned to see past surface differences to the common hopes and fears beneath, I felt a peace I had never experienced as a member of Grey Claw Pack. This was what love looked like when it was allowed to grow freely, not the desperate need for completion that I had felt with Roivan, but a choice made daily to support and cherish another person exactly as they were. "What happens now?" Lyra asked, joining us in the square. He was nearly 12 now, tall for his age and wise beyond his years, having grown up in a community where difference was celebrated rather than feared. "Now we rebuild," I said, pulling him close. "We make our home stronger and more beautiful than before. We continue proving that cooperation is possible, that love can transcend any boundary, that the future can be different from the past. And we keep choosing each other," Orion added, his wing coming around to encompass both Lyra and me. "Every day, we choose to be a family." Looking around at our settlement, damaged but not defeated, wounded but already healing, I felt my prophetic gift stir for the first time in months. The visions that came were different from anything I had experienced before, filled with images of growth and possibility rather than warning and loss. I saw children growing up bilingual in werewolf and Arcanite languages, learning to appreciate both cultures. I saw young adults forming romantic partnerships across species lines, their love celebrated rather than condemned. I saw communities throughout Elkard beginning to question the old prejudices, inspired by our example to try building something better. I saw a future where the divisions that had defined our world for centuries would gradually fade, replaced by new forms of organization based on choice and affinity rather than accident of birth. "The future is bright," I said, sharing my vision with my family. "Different from anything that came before, but bright." "How bright?" Lyra asked with the curiosity that had never left him despite all he had witnessed. I looked at Orion, at this demon who had chosen to love an exiled werewolf Omega, who had helped me build a home from nothing, who continued choosing me every day despite the complications that choice entailed. Bright enough to warm the coldest heart, I said. Bright enough to light the way for others who are still lost in the darkness of old hatreds. Bright enough to prove that love really can conquer fear. The war between werewolves and Arcanites would continue for several more years, but its outcome was already determined. Not by superior weapons or better tactics, but by the simple existence of communities like ours, proving daily that the barriers between peoples were constructed rather than natural. Change would come slowly, one heart at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time. But it would come because we had shown that it was possible. And at the center of that change, a rejected Omega and a fire demon would continue choosing each other, building a life that honored both their differences and their similarities, raising children who would never accept that love must be limited by the circumstances of birth. We had not been created for each other by any grand design, but we had chosen each other freely, completely, and permanently. And in a world where most relationships were dictated by biology or politics or tradition, that choice was the most radical act of all. Years later, when scholars wrote about the end of the ancient divisions in Elkard, they would point to battles and treaties and political developments as the turning points. But those of us who lived through the transformation knew the truth. Change began in a demon's tower, with a broken Omega who learned to love again and a fire demon who discovered that the greatest magic was not in commanding others, but in choosing to serve something larger than himself. Love had indeed conquered fear, not through force but through patience, not through dominance but through acceptance, not through changing others but through the courage to be changed. And in the end, that was enough to transform a world. But transformation, I learned, was not a single moment of victory, but an ongoing process that required constant vigilance and renewal. The years following our first successful defense brought new challenges, unexpected allies, and developments that would test everything we had built. The first major change came from an unexpected source, the humans. For generations, humans in Elkard had existed in the spaces between the dominant races, serving as intermediaries, servants, and occasional scapegoats for conflicts they had no power to influence. They had been so accustomed to powerlessness that most had never conceived of any alternative to their subordinate status. But our settlement changed that. For the first time, humans saw themselves as equals rather than dependents, contributing skills and knowledge that were valued for their own merit rather than their usefulness to their betters. And word of this change spread throughout the human communities like wildfire. "They're organizing," reported Marcus, a human trader who had become one of our most reliable sources of information about the outside world. "Villages that have served werewolf clans for generations are beginning to question why they should remain subservient. Some are even talking about declaring independence." "How are the clans responding?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "About as well as you'd expect. The Blood Senate has declared human independence movements to be rebellion incited by demon influence. They're mobilizing to crush the uprisings before they can spread." This development created a dilemma for our community. We had established ourselves as a neutral haven, welcoming refugees from all sides of the various conflicts but avoiding direct intervention in external politics. However, the human independence movements were clearly inspired by our example, and their leaders were explicitly calling for the kind of interracial cooperation we had proven possible. "We can't stay neutral forever," Orion observed as we discussed the situation in our council meetings. "Neutrality is a luxury that depends on other people's willingness to leave you alone. If the Blood Senate decides we're a threat that needs to be eliminated, our neutrality won't protect us. But if we openly support the human uprisings, we'll be declaring ourselves enemies of every werewolf clan in Elkard," countered Dr. Sarah, a human physician who had joined our community after fleeing persecution in her home village. "We're not ready for that kind of war. Are we ready for the kind of war that comes when oppressed people have nowhere else to turn?" asked Talone, a young Arcanite whose parents had been killed in one of the early werewolf raids. "Because that's what we're looking at if the clans succeed in crushing the human movements." The debate continued for hours with valid arguments on multiple sides. But it was Lyra, now 13 and possessed of the kind of moral clarity that only comes with youth, who cut through our complicated political calculations. "We can't save everyone," he said quietly, "but we can save the ones who make it to us, and we can make sure that everyone knows there's a place where different kinds of people can live together in peace." His words reminded us of our core mission, not to remake the world through force, but to provide an alternative model that others could choose to emulate. We decided to continue our policy of welcoming refugees while also quietly providing support to human communities that requested our assistance. This middle path proved more successful than any of us had anticipated. Human villages began sending delegations to study our organizational methods, our conflict resolution techniques, our approaches to interracial cooperation. They returned home with ideas and skills that helped them build more autonomous communities, even within the existing political structure. Meanwhile, our own settlement continued to grow and evolve. We had started with a few dozen refugees clustered around Orion's tower. 5 years later, we had become a small city with over 2,000 residents, complete with schools, workshops, marketplaces, and cultural centers that celebrated the traditions of all three races. "Do you remember when you worried that keeping Lyra would disrupt your routine?" I asked Orion one evening as we watched him lead a group of mixed-race children in a traditional Arcanite fire dancing ceremony. "I remember when my biggest concern was whether you would be useful enough to justify the expense of feeding you," he replied with the dry humor that had developed over our years together. Now look at us, running a small nation and raising a revolutionary. Lyra had indeed become something of a revolutionary, though his revolution was one of ideas rather than violence. At 13, he was already serving as an unofficial ambassador to human communities, helping them navigate the complexities of asserting their rights without triggering devastating retaliation. "He's going to be more influential than either of us," I observed, watching as he patiently explained the principles of consensus decision-making to a group of adult visitors from a distant human settlement. "Good," Orion said firmly. "The next generation should surpass the previous one. That's how progress works." Our own relationship had also continued to deepen and evolve over the years. The passionate intensity of early love had settled into something more sustainable but equally precious. A partnership built on shared values, mutual respect, and the kind of trust that comes from weathering storms together. "I've been thinking," Orion said one morning as we lay in bed, reluctant to rise and face another day of administrative responsibilities, "about making our bond official." I turned to look at him, surprised. "Official how?" "A formal bonding ceremony. Not the fated mate ritual your former pack practices, but something that acknowledges what we've built together. Something that announces to the world that we've chosen each other permanently." The idea was appealing but also complicated. Neither werewolf nor Arcanite traditions included ceremonies for interracial bonding, and creating our own ritual would be another step into uncharted territory. "What would such a ceremony look like?" I asked. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I think it should include elements from both our cultures, witnessed by our chosen family, focused on the promises we make to each other rather than the claims we make on each other. A celebration of choice rather than destiny," I mused. "I like that." Planning the ceremony became a community project that brought together traditions from all three races represented in our settlement. Werewolf concepts of pack loyalty combined with Arcanite rituals of flame and truth, while human customs of gift-giving and feast-sharing provided the framework for celebration. The ceremony itself took place on the 5th anniversary of our settlement's founding, in the garden where Royven had made his final plea for my return. We had chosen the location deliberately, not to dwell on past pain, but to demonstrate how completely our lives had been transformed. 5 years ago, I said as we stood before our assembled community, I was a broken exile with no hope and no future. Today, I stand here as a founder of something unprecedented in the history of Elkerd, a community where love transcends every boundary, where difference is celebrated rather than feared, where individuals can choose their own destiny. 5 years ago, Orion continued, I was a lonely scholar preserving knowledge in isolation. Today, I am part of a family, a community, a movement that proves every day that cooperation is not only possible but necessary for true prosperity. The vows we exchanged were simple but profound. We promised to continue choosing each other every day, to support each other's growth and dreams, to face whatever challenges came with united strength. Most importantly, we promised to remember that our love was not separate from our community but an integral part of it, an example of what became possible when barriers were removed and hearts were opened. We were not fated to be together, I concluded, echoing words that had become almost ritual between us. But we chose to be together, and that choice has created something more beautiful than any destiny. The celebration that followed lasted 3 days and drew visitors from throughout Elkard. Werewolves who had begun questioning the rigid hierarchies of clan life, Arkanites curious about the possibilities of interracial cooperation, humans eager to see proof that they could aspire to more than servitude. But perhaps the most significant visitor was one who arrived unannounced on the 3rd day of festivities. I was walking through the settlement's market square, enjoying the sight of our diverse community celebrating together, when I felt a familiar presence that made my newly awakened prophetic abilities flare with warning. Roivan emerged from the crowd, but he was not the proud alpha heir I remembered. This man was thinner, older, marked by what looked like years of struggle and loss. His once magnificent presence had been replaced by something quieter but perhaps more genuine. "Wing Fighter," he said, using the name Orion had given me rather than my birth name. "Congratulations on your bonding." "Thank you," I replied cautiously, uncertain what had brought him here after all these years. "I came to apologize," he said simply. "Not to ask for forgiveness, I know I have no right to that, but to tell you that I understand now what I threw away, and to acknowledge that you were right to refuse me when I finally realized my mistake." "What's happened to you?" I asked, noting the changes in his appearance and demeanor. "The same thing that happened to you, in a way. I was cast out from Grey Claw Pack when I refused to lead raids against human settlements. The Blood Senate declared me unfit for leadership, said I had been corrupted by exposure to demon influence." He smiled ruefully. "They weren't wrong about the corruption part, though they misunderstood the source. Where are you now?" "Leading a small group of wolves who've grown tired of the endless conflicts. We've established a settlement about a day's travel from here, trying to build something different from what we knew before." He paused, looking around at our thriving community. "Though nothing as ambitious or successful as what you've created. You're welcome to visit, to learn from what we've built here," I offered. "We've always been open to those who come in peace." "Thank you. That means more than you know." He hesitated, then continued. "I have something else to tell you. Something you deserve to know about the circumstances of your exile." A chill ran down my spine as my prophetic gift whispered warnings about revelations I might not want to hear. "What do you mean?" "The Pack Elders didn't just fear your prophetic abilities. They feared what those abilities might reveal about decisions they had made. There were irregularities in clan leadership, alliances with forces that should have been enemies, choices that prioritized personal power over pack welfare." "You're saying they engineered my exile?" "I'm saying they encouraged my rejection of our bond because they knew that as my mate, you would have access to clan secrets. They were afraid your visions might expose corruption they wanted to keep hidden." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. My exile hadn't been the result of superstition or even personal rejection. It had been a calculated move to eliminate a potential threat to corrupt leadership. "Did you know?" I asked, my voice barely steady. "When you rejected me, did you know?" "I suspected," he admitted, shame evident in his voice. "But I was young and ambitious and more concerned with my own position than with justice. I told myself I was making a hard choice for the good of the pack, but really I was just taking the easy path. And now I know that the easy path and the right path are rarely the same thing. Now I know that strength comes from doing what's right even when it's difficult, not from avoiding difficult decisions altogether." We talked for another hour, and I learned about the changes that had transformed the proud alpha heir into someone capable of genuine remorse and growth. His exile had been as painful as mine, but he had used it as an opportunity for reflection and development rather than bitterness and revenge. I want you to know, he said as our conversation drew to a close, that seeing what you've built here, seeing the love and respect in your bonding ceremony, has given me hope that redemption is possible, not restoration to what I was before, but transformation into something better. Redemption is always possible, I said, thinking of the journey that had brought me from broken exile to community leader. But it requires the courage to face uncomfortable truths about yourself and the commitment to do better going forward. I'm trying to find that courage, he said. Every day, I'm trying. After Royven left, I found myself walking alone through the settlement, processing the new information about my exile and what it meant for my understanding of the past. Ayaan found me sitting by the small lake we had created as part of our expansion, staring at the water and trying to sort through my emotions. Difficult conversation? He asked, settling beside me on the stone bench. Illuminating, I replied, and painful, and ultimately liberating, I think. I told him what Royven had revealed about the political motivations behind my exile, about the corruption that had shaped so many of the decisions that had seemed personal at the time. Does it change anything? Ayaan asked when I finished. Knowing that your rejection was orchestrated rather than genuine? It changes everything and nothing, I said after considering the question. It changes my understanding of what happened, but it doesn't change where I ended up or the choices I made afterward. If anything, it makes me more grateful for the life we've built together. How so? Because it means that even the worst betrayals, even the most calculated cruelty, can become the foundation for something beautiful if we choose to transform pain into purpose. Ayaan was quiet for a moment, then reached over to take my hand. You realize what this means for our larger mission here? That corruption and injustice are more widespread than we thought? That our example is more necessary than we thought? If the leaders of major clans are willing to destroy individual lives to protect their secrets, then the whole system needs to be challenged. He was right, of course. The revelation about my exile was just one example of the kind of abuse that thrived in systems built on rigid hierarchy and unquestioned authority. Our settlement represented more than just an alternative way of living. It was a fundamental challenge to the power structures that enabled such abuse. So what do we do about it? I asked. We continue being ourselves, he said simply. We continue proving that better ways are possible. We continue offering refuge to those who need it and education to those who seek it. We continue loving each other and raising our children and building our community. That seems almost too simple. The most powerful revolutions often are. They don't succeed by defeating the old system in direct confrontation, but by making it irrelevant through the creation of better alternatives. Over the following months, his words proved prophetic. Our settlement continued to grow and thrive, attracting not just refugees but also delegations from established communities seeking guidance on governance, conflict resolution, and economic cooperation. We developed a curriculum for visiting leaders that covered everything from consensus decision-making to resource sharing to intercultural communication. More importantly, we provided them with a lived example of how abstract ideals could be implemented in practical ways. You're training the next generation of leaders throughout Elkhart, observed Professor Elena, a human scholar who had come to study our educational methods. Students who go back to their home communities carrying new ideas about what's possible. We're planting seeds, I corrected. Whether they grow depends on the soil they find when they return home. But the seeds were indeed growing. Reports reached us regularly of communities implementing new forms of governance, establishing trade relationships across racial lines, even creating their own versions of our interracial councils. The most significant development came in the form of a delegation from the city of Thornwick, a major human settlement that had traditionally served as a trading post between werewolf and Arcanite territories. We want to declare independence, their leader announced during our first meeting. Not just from werewolf overlordship, but from the whole system of racial hierarchy. We want to establish ourselves as a free city where all races are welcome as equals. That's a significant step, I said carefully. Are you prepared for the consequences? We've been preparing for 2 years, she replied. Ever since our first delegation visited your settlement and saw what was possible. We've been quietly building alliances with other human communities, establishing trade relationships that don't depend on werewolf or arcanite intermediaries, training our own defense forces. And you want our support? We want your expertise. Your community has solved problems we're just beginning to face. We need to learn from your experience if we're going to succeed. The request put us in a difficult position. Supporting Thornwick's independence would definitely end any pretense of neutrality and would likely trigger a coordinated response from both the Blood Senate and the Arcanite High Councils. But refusing to help would mean abandoning our principles and potentially watching a promising experiment fail for lack of guidance. We'll help, I said after consulting with our community council, but not with military support, with knowledge, training, and diplomatic assistance. We'll teach you what we've learned about building inclusive communities, but you'll have to defend your independence with your own strength. That's all we ask, she replied. We're not looking for someone to fight our battles for us. We just want to learn from those who've succeeded in creating the kind of society we're trying to build. What followed was an intensive 6-month training program that brought dozens of Thornwick's future leaders to our settlement. They studied our governance structures, our economic systems, our approaches to education and conflict resolution. More importantly, they experienced firsthand what it felt like to live in a truly integrated community. It's not perfect, one of them observed during a discussion session. There are still tensions, still disagreements, still moments when old prejudices surface. Of course there are, I agreed. Building an inclusive community doesn't eliminate conflict. It just gives you better tools for resolving conflict constructively. How do you handle it when someone can't or won't adapt to the new ways? Another participant asked. Very carefully, Ayaan replied. We've learned that some people need more time and support to overcome lifetime conditioning. Others genuinely prefer the old ways and eventually choose to leave. A few have had to be asked to leave because their behavior was harmful to the community. The key, I added, is distinguishing between people who are struggling to change and people who are refusing to change. The first group deserves patience and help. The second group gets clear boundaries and consistent consequences. When the Thornwick delegation returned home, they carried with them not just new knowledge but also renewed confidence in their mission. The formal Declaration of Independence came 6 months later, coinciding with the establishment of a new city charter that explicitly guaranteed equal rights and opportunities to all residents regardless of race. The response was swift and predictable. The Blood Senate declared Thornwick to be in rebellion and began mobilizing forces to retake the city. Several Arcanite clans, seeing an opportunity to expand their influence, also began moving forces toward the disputed territory. But something unexpected happened. Instead of facing the conflict alone, Thornwick found itself supported by a network of allied communities that had been quietly preparing for this moment. Human settlements that had implemented their own reforms declared solidarity with the new free city. Even some werewolf and Arcanite communities, particularly those led by younger leaders who had studied at our settlement, announced their support for Thornwick's right to self-determination. It's becoming a genuine independence movement, Marcus reported after returning from one of his trading circuits. Not just isolated rebellions, but coordinated action across racial and territorial lines. The old power structures are being challenged simultaneously in dozens of locations. How are the traditional authorities responding? I asked. Panic, mostly. The Blood Senate is trying to coordinate with the Arcanite councils to present a united front. But they're having difficulty because their own supporters are split on whether to suppress the movement or try to co-opt it. The political crisis created opportunities for our settlement to play a more visible role in regional affairs. We began hosting diplomatic meetings between various factions, providing neutral ground where conflicts could be discussed without immediate resort to violence. It was during one of these diplomatic sessions that I encountered an old friend under unexpected circumstances. Talon, the young Arcanite who had joined our community after his parents' death, had grown into a skilled negotiator and cultural bridge builder. He was leading our side of a complex mediation between a werewolf clan and an Arcanite flight that had been feuding over territory rights. The fundamental issue, he explained to the assembled delegates, is that you're both operating from outdated assumptions about how territorial claims work. The old system assumed that different races couldn't share space safely, so territorial disputes had to be resolved through dominance. But we've proven that assumption false. Easy words from someone who's never had to defend his people's hunting grounds, growled the werewolf representative. Actually, Talon replied calmly, I'm a direct descendant of the Crimson Wing flight that was driven from these lands by werewolf expansion 3 generations ago. My great-grandfather died defending territory that your clan now claims as ancestral homeland. The admission stunned everyone present. Talon had never spoken publicly about his family history, and his willingness to mediate a dispute involving the very clan responsible for his family's exile demonstrated a level of personal growth that impressed even me. And yet you're willing to help us find a peaceful solution? Asked the Arcanite representative. I'm willing to help you find a solution that prevents other children from growing up as orphans, Talon replied. Revenge might be satisfying in the short term, but it doesn't build the kind of future I want to live in. The mediation was successful, resulting in an innovative territorial sharing agreement that allowed both groups to use the disputed lands for their traditional purposes without conflict. More importantly, it demonstrated that even the deepest historical grievances could be overcome through creative problem-solving and genuine commitment to peace. You've raised an extraordinary young man, the Arcanite delegate told me privately after the agreement was signed. His ability to transform personal pain into public service is remarkable. He raised himself, really? I replied. We just provided a safe environment for his natural wisdom to develop. But the delegate's words reminded me of how much our little family had grown and changed over the years. Lyra was now 16 and serving as an official ambassador to human communities throughout the region. Talon, at 25, had become one of our most skilled mediators and was being courted by several independent cities as a potential leader. Are you worried about them leaving? Orion asked that evening as we watched both young men leading a discussion group for newly arrived refugees. I'm proud that they're ready to leave, I said. Raising children isn't about keeping them close. It's about preparing them to make their own contributions to the world. Even if those contributions take them far from home, especially then. The values we've taught them, the skills they've developed, the confidence they've gained, those things go with them wherever they choose to serve. As if to prove my point, Lyra approached us after the discussion group concluded, his expression serious in the way that usually preceded important announcements. I've been invited to establish a new settlement, he said without preamble. A coalition of human communities in the Eastern Territories wants to create their own version of what we've built here. They've asked me to serve as founding coordinator. That's a tremendous honor, I said, though my heart clenched at the thought of losing him. It's also a tremendous responsibility, he replied. I wanted to ask your advice about whether I'm ready for something like this. What does your heart tell you? Orion asked. That this is why I was born. That everything I've learned here, every skill I've developed, every relationship I've built, it's all been preparation for this opportunity. Then you have your answer, I said, pulling him into a fierce embrace. You're ready, more than ready. Will you come visit? Will you help if we run into problems we can't solve? Always, Orion promised. You'll always have a home here, and you'll always have our support wherever your service takes you. Lyra's departure 3 months later was bittersweet. Watching him lead a convoy of supplies and volunteers toward his new assignment filled me with pride and loss in equal measure. Our quiet family of 3 had been the foundation upon which everything else was built, and now it was time for that foundation to support new structures in new places. But our family continued to grow in unexpected ways. Talon remained with us, though his work increasingly took him to other communities as demand for skilled mediators expanded. We also found ourselves serving as guardians for a steady stream of young people whose own families had been disrupted by the ongoing political changes. We've become an institution, I observed one evening as we sat down to dinner with 12 people around our table. Refugees, students, visiting delegates, and adopted family members from multiple races and backgrounds. We've become what we always intended to be, Orion corrected. A place where people can discover their potential and find their purpose. And where they can experience love that transcends every boundary, added Marcus, a young werewolf who had fled his clan after refusing to participate in raids against human settlements. For some of us, this is the first place we've ever felt truly accepted. His words reminded me of my own journey from rejected exile to community founder. The transformation hadn't been easy or quick, but it had been complete. The broken Omega who had been sold in a slave market no longer existed. He had been replaced by someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more capable of love. 10 years ago, I said, raising my glass in an impromptu toast, I thought my life was over. Today, I can't imagine a more fulfilling existence. To second chances, chosen families, and the power of love to create miracles. To the future we're building together, Orion added, and to the courage to keep choosing hope over fear. As our extended family echoed the toast, I felt my prophetic gift stir once again. The visions that came were not of specific events but of possibilities, a world where the divisions that had defined Elkhart for centuries continued to erode, where young people grew up expecting cooperation rather than conflict, where love was celebrated rather than constrained by traditional boundaries. It would take time, perhaps generations, but the transformation had already begun. Every successful mediation, every new integrated community, every interracial partnership added momentum to changes that were becoming impossible to reverse. The future is bright, I said, sharing my vision with my family. Not perfect, but bright with possibility. How bright? Asked Sarah, a young Arcanite who had joined us after being exiled for defending human rights. I looked around the table at the faces gathered there, werewolves, Arcanites, and humans who had chosen to build something beautiful together despite every historical precedent suggesting it was impossible. Bright enough to illuminate the path for others who are still finding their way, I said. Bright enough to prove that love really is stronger than hate, that cooperation really is more powerful than conflict, that the future really can be different from the past. And in the years that followed, that brightness continued to spread, one heart at a time, one family at a time, one community at a time, until the world itself began to change in ways that once seemed impossible but had become inevitable through the accumulated power of individual choices to love rather than fear. Our story had begun with rejection and exile, but it had become something much larger, a testament to the transformative power of love, the importance of chosen family, and the possibility that even the most entrenched systems of division and hatred could be overcome by those brave enough to imagine and create better alternatives. We had not been fated to be together, but we had chosen each other. And that choice had indeed proven stronger than any destiny, creating ripples of change that would continue expanding long after our own story had ended.